My millionaire grandfather's funeral wasn't even over yet when my parents, who had ignored me my whole life, started a legal battle to challenge his will. I remember looking at the documents, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. But the real shock came later, inside that civil courtroom in Mexico City. My mother rolled her eyes as soon as I walked in, as if she already knew she would win. Then the judge looked up, froze, and said, "Wait, the lawsuit is against you." Every whisper in the room stopped. My parents stared at me, confused. They had no idea who I really was or what I had been waiting years to do. I grew up in a house where love was measured in silence. My parents, Adriana and Mitchell Morales, lived 2 states away, but they might as well have been on another planet. They were the type to send postcards instead of calling, the type who only showed up for Christmas if a camera was around. When I was 3 months old, they left me with my grandparents for just a few weeks. Those weeks stretched into decades. My first memory isn't my mother's perfume or my father's voice. It's my grandmother, Felicia's kitchen. The smell of melting butter, the gentle tap of her wooden spoon against the bowl, the sound of her laughter when I got chocolate sprinkles everywhere. "The best cookies always have too much of everything," she would say. She never scolded me, never sighed as if I were a burden. To her, I was enough. My grandfather, Judge Warren Paredes, was a man carved from discipline and kindness. Every afternoon he'd come home from the courthouse, still in his robes, set down his briefcase, and ask, "What did my favorite lawyer in training learn today?" I would hold up my crayon drawings, and he would study them as if they were legal documents. I thought all families were like this until I started school. The other kids had parents at their soccer games, school plays, and parent-teacher meetings. I had 2 empty chairs and a grandmother who waved twice as hard to make up for it. When I asked why my parents didn't come, my grandmother would say, "They're busy with important things, my love." I wanted to believe her, but even at 7, I could feel the crack widening. Like a fissure in a wall nobody wanted to fix. The few times they did visit, it was always the same. Adriana would arrive in designer heels, kiss the air near my cheek, and spend the entire visit glued to her phone. Mitchell would stay outside, honking the car horn to hurry her along. I learned early on that pretending was their favorite family tradition, but my grandparents never spoke badly of them. My grandfather used to say, "Justice isn't about revenge, Talia. It's about showing up." And he showed up for every scraped knee, every science fair, and every graduation photo. When kids at school talked about inheritances or family businesses, I didn't think about money. I thought about his voice reading legal journal articles to me before bed, with the constant hum of the old heater in his study. I thought about how his eyes would soften when my grandmother laughed. I see it clearly now. Love was presence, not a promise. An absence. Absence was a choice. So when he died, when the will revealed he had left me everything, it wasn't greed that angered my parents. It was the exposure. The money didn't humiliate them, the truth did, and they would rather destroy me than face what they had done. The first major crack appeared on a gray November morning when I was 18. I had driven home from college to surprise my grandmother. I found her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, planting tulip bulbs even though the ground was half frozen. "Spring is worth the wait," she smiled. That evening, she was gone. She collapsed among the flower beds she loved. I found my grandfather sitting there hours later, still holding her gardening gloves. He didn't cry. He just stared at the dirt, whispering her name as if she might answer. We buried her 3 days later. My parents arrived late, left before the memorial service, and never called afterward. That was the day I stopped making excuses for them. From then on, Sundays became sacred. My grandfather and I would cook together, his famous stew and my burnt cookies, and we would talk about the law, about truth, and about how people hide behind appearances. He told me, "The law reveals who people truly are, Talia. It strips away their performance." At the time, I didn't know how literal that lesson would become. Years passed. I graduated from law school and became a public prosecutor, and my grandfather watched every milestone with the same quiet pride. My parents sent a 2-line card. "Good job, proud of you." That was their version of love. Then, at 87, my grandfather passed away in his sleep. The house felt colder without him, as if the walls missed his voice. At the reading of the will, I expected to get his books, maybe his watch, something sentimental. Instead, the lawyer handed me everything. The house, his savings and investments, more than 30 million pesos in total, and a sealed letter addressed only to me. It said, "You earned this, not by blood, but by presence." I remember clutching that letter so tightly, my hands shook. It was finally validation, not wealth. But then, the storm arrived. 30 days later, Reed, my closest colleague and friend, called from his office. His voice was careful, too careful. "They're suing to invalidate the will, Talia." "They're what?" "Your parents. They're claiming undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity." I laughed. "They think I manipulated him. They're accusing me of controlling an old man for his money?" The laughter caught in my throat, sharp and painful. Of course they were. Of course. That night, I drove to the house and went into my grandfather's study. I found a folder simply labeled Payments. Inside were decades of records, monthly transfers to my parents, notes he wrote each time they asked for more. "Adriana requests an increase. Mitchell's business is failing again." Page after page, it added up to more than 8 million pesos. He knew this day might come. He had prepared me for it. I sat in the dark with the folder spread across the desk and whispered, "You saw them so clearly, didn't you, Grandpa?" The anger burned low and steady, cold and precise. They wanted to drag me to court. Fine. They would finally meet the woman they had created. Reed warned me things would get ugly, but even he didn't imagine how far they would go. Within a week, headlines started appearing in local papers. "Granddaughter accused of manipulating retired judge." The reporters didn't know my name yet, but I could already feel the whispers in the courthouse hallways. Colleagues who once greeted me with respect now looked away. I remember sitting in my office late one night, with only the light from my lamp and the hum of the city far below. On my screen were the scanned legal filings, pages of lies disguised as grief. They were requesting the will be nullified, painting me as a predator, my own parents. For a moment, I almost believed their version of me. That's what family can do. They convince you that you're the villain for finally setting boundaries. I closed the laptop with trembling hands and reached for the box I'd brought from my grandfather's house. Inside were the payments, the bills, the messages he had meticulously saved, proof of 20 years of silence disguised as dependency. I spread everything out on the floor, receipts, transfer slips, letters from my mother asking for just a little more, promises that were never kept. Every page was a confession, and my grandfather had saved them all, organized, labeled, and dated. My pulse calmed. The chaos in my chest turned into something colder, sharper. When Reed stopped by the next morning, he found me sitting on the floor, surrounded by stacks of evidence. "I guess we're going to war," I said softly. He looked at the papers, then at me. "Are you sure you want to do this?" "I don't want to," I said. "But they do. I'm just giving them what they asked for." That week, we built the case piece by piece. We gathered witness statements, timelines, copies of every transfer, my grandfather's handwritten notes, his emails, and his medical checkups, proving he was lucid until the very end. It wasn't about revenge. It was about precision, the kind of justice he taught me to believe in. Still, the nights were the hardest. Some part of me, the daughter part, still wanted them to stop, to apologize, to remember that I was their little girl. But that hope had died long ago, somewhere between unanswered birthday calls and forgotten graduations. By the time the court date arrived, the fear was gone. In its place was something firmer, resolution. They wanted to face me in court. They just didn't understand whose courtroom they were walking into. On the morning of the hearing, the city woke up to a cold drizzle. The streets glistened like broken glass, and my reflection in the courthouse window looked more like a stranger than a daughter. Inside, The marble floors amplified my every step, deliberate and firm. I could feel the stares, the whispers. That's her, the granddaughter, the defendant. When I pushed open the courtroom doors, the air was thick with perfume and tension. My mother was in the front row, her hair perfect, her lips painted a soft pink, a color meant to look innocent. She looked up, saw me, and rolled her eyes. It was a long, practiced gesture, the same one she used when I was 7 and spilled juice on her designer coat. My father stared at the floor like a man hoping to save himself by becoming invisible. Then Judge Elias looked up. For a second, his face was neutral, just another case. Then his eyes locked on mine, and recognition crossed his face. "Wait, the lawsuit is against you?" he said aloud before correcting himself. The courtroom fell still. Even my mother stopped pretending. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Proceed." Their lawyer stood up first. His voice was smooth, his gestures theatrical. I'd seen his type hundreds of times, the kind who thinks charm can rewrite facts. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is a tragedy. A devoted daughter, unfairly cut out of her father's will by a manipulative granddaughter who exploited an old man's grief." He gestured toward my mother. Adriana dabbed her eyes with a tissue that probably matched her outfit. "Judge Paredes adored his daughter," the lawyer continued. "But in his final years, he was vulnerable, confused, and isolated. My client, Mrs. Morales, was denied the chance to reconcile. Instead, her father's estate was unjustly diverted. I sat with my hands clasped, just listening. My heart rate didn't even speed up. I had spent years facing men who lied better than this. When he finished, Reed stood up. No theatrics, just quiet authority. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Judge Warren Paredes was of sound mind and deliberate in his decisions. It will also show that the plaintiffs, Mr. and Mrs. Morales, received more than 8 million pesos over 20 years, while visiting less than once a year." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Their lawyer called my mother to the stand. She adjusted her blazer, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. "He was everything to me," she began, her voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "I loved my father deeply. We spoke often, but after his wife died, he withdrew from everyone." Reed stood for the cross-examination. His tone was polite, surgical. "Mrs. Morales, according to your father's calendar, you visited him 4 times in the first year of your daughter's life. Christmas, Easter, his birthday, and one Saturday in July. Is that correct?" Her lips tightened. "I was young. I don't recall the exact numbers." Reed held up a folder. "The payments. Your father documented every visit, along with monthly transfers to you and Mr. Morales. Over 8 million pesos in total. Can you explain why a man who was being manipulated would continue to make voluntary payments for 2 decades? Her voice broke. "He wanted to help." Reed leaned in slightly. "Yes, he helped, but only financially. Emotionally, you were absent. Physically, you were absent too. When was the last time you saw your father before he died?" Silence. She glanced at my father, who looked away. 3 years before he died," Reed supplied. "On his 84th birthday. You stayed for 90 minutes. No cake, no photos. Is that correct?" She swallowed. "Yes." He paused just long enough for the truth to burn. "So, the man you claimed to love died believing you were too busy to visit him, and now you stand here claiming his fortune belonged to you?" Their lawyer objected. Argumentative. "Sustained," Judge Elias said quietly, but his eyes never left my mother. Next, it was my father's turn. Mitchell took the stand, his hands fidgeting. He looked smaller than I remembered. Reed was brief. "Mr. Morales, did you attend your daughter's high school graduation?" "No." "College?" He hesitated. "We were out of town." "Law school?" He shook his head. Reed projected a photo onto the courtroom screen. It was me in my cap and gown with my grandfather in the front row, clapping. The silence was heavy. "You weren't there," Reed said. He was. I looked at the photo, my throat tightening, not with pain, but with pride. Their lawyer tried one last time. Your Honor, grief clouds judgment. My clients loved their father. They were victims of manipulation. Judge Elias nodded once. Let's hear from the defendant. I stood up. The sound of my heels on the floor felt like a countdown. I raised my right hand, took the oath, and sat down. Reed began. Ms. Morales, can you tell the court about your relationship with your grandfather? I looked directly at my mother. He raised me. He taught me to tell the truth, even when it hurts. Their lawyer jumped in. Isn't it true that you benefited financially from that relationship? Yes, I said, but not in the way you're implying. He gave me something that can't be bought. Consistency. He showed up. Did you encourage him to exclude his daughter from the will? I met his gaze. If I had wanted the inheritance, I wasted a lot of time having dinner with an old man instead of networking. But I wasn't after money. I was holding on to the only family I had left. The courtroom was silent. Reed handed the judge the sealed letter my grandfather had left for me. Judge Elias read it silently, his expression softening. He looked up. This letter alone speaks volumes. He turned to my parents. The court finds that Judge Paredes' will reflects his true and deliberate intent. There is no evidence of undue influence or lack of capacity. Consequently, the plaintiff's claims are denied. The plaintiffs are ordered to pay all court costs and fees. My mother gasped as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. My father slumped in his chair. As the room emptied, she approached me, her voice trembling. Talia, please, can we talk? I looked at her, the same woman who had once left me and never looked back. Talk about what, Adriana? I'm your mother. I shook my head. You are the woman who gave birth to me. My mother was Felicia Paredes. Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing, only clarity. I turned to leave but paused at the door. The courtroom lights reflected off the marble, and for the first time in years, I felt a weight lift. You never knew who I really was, I whispered. Outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and clean. I walked down the steps of the courthouse, my heels punctuating the end of a story that was finally over. When I stepped outside, the sky had turned a pale silver, the color it gets just before it rains. Reporters were waiting on the steps, their microphones like small weapons. I walked right through them without a statement, without a victory speech, just the sound of my heels cutting through the noise. Back in the car, I finally exhaled. For the first time, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. My grandfather used to say, "Justice is slow, but it always arrives on time." He was right. It just took 32 years. The weeks after the trial were quiet. My parents disappeared from the headlines and from my life. No calls, no apologies, just silence, the language they always spoke best. But this time, it didn't hurt. 3 years later, I stood behind the same judge's bench where my grandfather once presided. I was now wearing his robes. Judge Talia Morales, 39 years old, the youngest in the history of the city. On my first day, I touched the wood of the bench he had used and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa." The years went by, promotions came, and so did peace. At 60, I retired. My last visit was to the cemetery, where tulips bloomed around 2 headstones, Warren and Felicia Paredes. I knelt and planted some new bulbs beside them. "You were right," I said softly. "Family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up." And as the wind moved through the trees, I could almost hear his laughter again, steady, proud, and free. Family isn't written in a last name. It's demonstrated with presence. I learned that too late to save my parents, but just in time to save myself.